There is a book in Białowieża National Park called the European Bison Pedigree Book Księga Rodowodowa Żubrów. It was first compiled in 1931 and published in 1932 by a German naturalist named Gord von der Groben under the authority of the International Society for the Protection of the European Bison. The first edition contains 171 individual animals, living and dead. Every one of them named, numbered, and traced back through its parents, because in 1931, that was the only way to be certain which animals were still, genetically, European bison. I looked at it for a long time. Then, I went looking for what it showed. What this book shows is not a curiosity. It shows a species that had stopped existing as a wild population and started existing as a document. The record confirms that. What the record does not confirm, not fully, not without digging, is why the wild population ended when the official record says it did, and what else the record quietly stopped counting at the same time. Here is what the record tells us about the world this book came from. By the early 1930s, European bison existed only in captivity in zoos, private menageries, and a handful of breeding parks scattered across Europe. The species had been functionally extinct in the wild since 1919. Von der Groben and the society he worked under set out to solve a narrow, practical problem. Cattle had been crossbred into some captive herds over the decades, and without a registry, no one could say with confidence which animals were pure bison bonuses and which were hybrids. The 1932 book was built to answer that question. Every animal got a pedigree number. Every pedigree number was tied to documented parentage, back as far as the records allowed. Later analysis, done decades afterward by researchers named Slatis and Olek, went back through those pedigree lines and found something the original compilers had no way to see. Of the animals with unknown ancestry in the founding generation, 28 were potential founders. Of those 28, only 12 turned out to be true genetic founders, the only ancestors every living European bison can be traced back to today. 11 other potential founding lines went extinct without leaving descendants, in part because a captive breeding herd at Woburn Abbey, in England, was quietly shut down. To the people compiling the pedigree book in 1932, none of this was remarkable. It was paperwork. It was the ordinary, unglamorous work of keeping a stud registry current. No one filling in those columns was thinking about founder effects or genetic bottlenecks. They were tracking who was related to whom, animal by animal, the way a clerk tracks any inventory that needs to stay accurate. The two founders who would come to matter most were a breeding pair, bull number 42, named Planta, and bull number 45, named Plebeger. In the pedigree book's early pages, they are two entries among 171. Nothing marks them as more important than any other pair. There was no way, in 1932, to know that their descendants would eventually dominate one of the two genetic lines. The species would be split into the lowland line, bred exclusively from 7 lowland founders, as distinct from the broader lowland Caucasian line built from all 12. The book records lineage. It does not record consequence. Consequence is something that only becomes visible generations later when someone runs the numbers forward. Here is where the record goes quiet. The official extinction date for the wild European bison in Białowieża Forest is recorded as February 9 or the 19th of February 1919, the day a local man, Bartłomiej Szpakowicz, shot a female bison in the forest interior. That date is the one conservation literature repeats. It is the marker used in nearly every summary of the species' history. Before that date, the forestry and hunting records of Białowieża describe a population, however diminished, of wild animals moving through the forest. After it, the record treats the wild population as ended. But the state's own investigation into the Szpakowicz shooting says otherwise. Paweł Bark, commander of the local civic guard, and Herman Knoth, a delegate of the Polish Ministry of Public Works, took depositions in March and April of 1919. Their testimony documents wild bison still being tracked in the forest through April of that year after the date the record treats as final. The transition is documented, in the sense that the shooting itself has a paper trail. What is not documented is the actual end of the population, the exact date, the last confirmed sighting, the moment the forest genuinely emptied of wild bison. This is not the silence of a war or a fire. Those produce their own records, damage reports, casualty counts, accounts of what was lost. This silence produced nothing. The population was there. Then, according to the official record, it was not. The record does not contain the space between those two facts. The pedigree book, compiled 12 years later, opens in 1932 with the species already understood as captive only. It does not include an entry for whatever bison, bark, and noth were still tracking that April. Those animals, if they existed as long as the depositions suggest, are not in it. They are not in any book. I looked for the same kind of gap somewhere else, and found it close by, inside the very administration that had claimed to be protecting the species. In 1888, Tsar Alexander III issued a decree bringing Białowieża Forest under the direct control of the Imperial Russian court, with the stated aim of preserving the forest and its bison. That decree is the one usually cited as the founding act of the forest's modern protection. But the imperial hunting records from the period the decree covers, 1888 to 1912, show 153 bison killed in organized royal hunts, 56 more killed specifically for museum exhibits, and 72 captured alive for menageries and breeding experiments elsewhere. The protection decree and the removal of nearly 300 animals sit in the same set of records, under the same administration, in the same years. Neither one erased the other from the paperwork. They just sat, side by side, unreconciled, until someone went looking. Roughly 120 kilometers away, at Woburn Abbey in England, the same shape of silence appears again in a completely different country's records. A captive breeding herd there, one of the herds that fed into the founding generation the pedigree book would later document, was shut down. The termination is not publicly announced in the sources available. It is known only because the pedigree lines it should have produced simply stop. 11 founder lines vanish from the record with no accompanying account of why the herd ended, only the genetic absence where descendants should be. And then there is the forest itself. For most of the 20th century, Białowieża was described in scientific and popular literature as an untouched primeval wilderness, a forest that had developed without meaningful human intervention. That description was official enough to shape how the forest was studied and protected for decades. It was disproven only recently by airborne laser scanning surveys that mapped the forest floor beneath the canopy. The surveys, led by researcher Tomasz Samojlik and published in journals including Earth System Science Data and Forest Ecology and Management, found more than 200 archaeological sites hidden under the tree's 17th and 18th century charcoal hearths, wood tar kilns, potash kilns, bog iron sites. A national survey using the same method found 634,815 relict charcoal hearths across Polish forests generally, part of the same industrial pattern. None of it was in the conservation record. The forest had been called untouched for so long that the word became the description, and the description outlasted the evidence. There is a fifth version of the same pattern, sitting in between the imperial hunts and the primeval forest myth, in the years of German military occupation from 1915 to 1918. Under Major Georg Escherich's forestry administration, the occupying army extracted 5 million cubic meters of timber from the forest, more than 15% of its entire standing reserve, taken from a reserve that both the preceding Russian administration and the following Polish one described, in their own records, as protected. The occupation kept meticulous logs of what it removed. Those logs exist. What doesn't exist, in the record as it survives, is any reconciliation between the extraction totals and the protected status the forest carried on paper both before the occupation and after it. 3 separate administrations, Russian, German, Polish, each kept their own accurate books. None of the 3 books explained to each other what happened in between. 5 instances then, not 4. A shooting whose aftermath went undocumented. A captive herd, in England, whose closure went unannounced. A protection decree that sat beside 300 recorded kills, a wartime occupation that logged its own extraction without reconciling it against the protection it interrupted. A wilderness designation that outlived the physical evidence against it by 2 centuries. Only one of those 5 happened somewhere else entirely, Woburn Abbey, a different country, a different institution. The other 4 all happened inside the same forest, under different regimes, at different moments. That is a narrower geographic spread than I went looking for, and I want to be upfront about that rather than dress it up as something it isn't. But the shape repeats regardless of distance, and regardless of which government was holding the pen, a record that was accurate about what it counted, and silent about what it had stopped counting. Here is the question I kept returning to. Not why did the wild population end when the record says it did? How does a population, or a landscape, stop being visible to a record without anyone deciding to make it invisible? A world becomes invisible to a record when the record's categories no longer contain it. Not through fire, not through a decision anyone signed their name to. Through the ordinary administrative act of updating what gets counted. Białowieża had a vocabulary in 1,919, hunting logs, forestry inventories, wild population counts. That vocabulary described a forest with animals still moving through it, however few. By 1932, the vocabulary had changed. The pedigree book counted captive individuals by pedigree number. It had no column for a wild bison someone thought they saw in April 1919, not because anyone hid that animal, because the new form had nowhere to put it. What cannot be entered into the record cannot be counted by the record, and what cannot be counted cannot be protected by whatever protection the record was designed to provide. The same mechanism explains the forest floor. Białowieża's administrative vocabulary, once it settled on primeval wilderness, had no category for a 17th century charcoal hearth. The kilns weren't destroyed by that classification. They were simply outside what the classification was built to see. It took a laser, 200 years later, to read ground the paperwork had never been designed to describe. If you're still with me at this point, it's worth subscribing. This is the part of the story that usually gets skipped, and there's more of it ahead. Herman Nothe arrives in Białowieża in March 1919. He is a delegate of the Polish Ministry of Public Works, sent to the forest to investigate the Szpakowicz shooting. He takes a deposition. He is doing his job. Along with Paweł Bark, the local Civic Guard commander, he records testimony that places living wild bison in the forest interior weeks and then months after the date that will become the official extinction marker. Knuth is not covering anything up. He is not protecting anyone. He is filling out a state investigation protocol exactly as his position required. His report becomes part of the record, and the record, once compiled into later summaries, keeps his signature on the investigation, while dropping the detail that undercuts the date it settled on. He was not deciding what the species' history would say. He was writing down testimony in an office in a forest in 1919. The compression of his report into a single accepted extinction date happened somewhere after him, in the retelling, not in his own account. The pedigree book that opens in 1932 predates none of this. It simply never had a place to put what Nothe recorded. Nothing shows that anyone who compiled it in 1932 ever read his deposition at all. What happened to the wild population of Białowieża is not a mystery solved at the top. It is a gap that opened at a desk, in an ordinary report, and was never closed. I want to be honest about what this record cannot show me. Not as a disclaimer, as the most precise thing I can say about what this looked like from the inside. It cannot tell me whether the gap between the official extinction date and the April sightings was an oversight or simply how imprecise record-keeping worked in a collapsing wartime administration. It cannot tell me whether the people compiling the 1,932 pedigree book knew about Nothe's testimony and left it out, or never encountered it at all. And it cannot tell me whether Białowieża's pattern protection decrees beside unrecorded losses, wilderness designations beside buried industry reflects something particular to this forest, or is simply what every heavily administered landscape looks like once you check its records against physical evidence. What the pedigree book shows is real. What the imperial hunting logs show is real. The shape of the silence between the official date and the deposition testimony is real. What I cannot show you is intent. A gap in the record is not proof that someone meant to create it. I'll also say this plainly. I spent a long time with this one book before I went looking for the pattern around it. That is exactly the condition under which a person starts finding a pattern everywhere. I'm not exempt from that. What I'm asking you to weigh is whether the record actually supports what I've laid out here, or whether a simpler explanation, an under-resourced wartime bureaucracy, doing its best, missing things accounts for all of it. I have not found that simpler explanation. That is not a conclusion. That is where the research stopped. There is one thing that connects this book to where we are standing now. Every European bison alive today, more than 9,000 of them descends from 12 founder genotypes. And within that 12, 2 individuals dominate the ancestry. Founder number 42, a bull named Planta, and founder number 45, a bull named Plebeger. Their genes are disproportionately present in the modern species, to the point that statisticians studying the pedigree decades later found something the original compilers had no framework to notice: that the most inbred line of modern bison, the one descended almost entirely from Planta and Plebeger, actually shows better calf survival in its first month than the more genetically diverse line, not despite the inbreeding. Alongside it, the forced narrowing of the gene pool appears to have purged some of the worst recessive traits along with the diversity. That fact was sitting in the pedigree book's numbers the entire time. Von der Groben and the compilers who followed him recorded every birth, every parent, every pedigree number, faithfully, for decades, without any way to see what those numbers would eventually reveal. They weren't hiding it. Their form had no category called genetic purging. It only had columns for lineage. It survived, unrecognized, inside a document that was never trying to record it. It was just recording everything else precisely enough that the pattern was still there to find. Once someone with statistics and pedigree software went looking in the 1990s and 2000s, the book is still in Białowieża National Park. It is still published annually. It still records pedigree numbers, still tracks descent, exactly as it did in 1932. Nothing about the document itself has changed. What has changed is what the numbers contain, now that you know what produced them. A species reduced to a registry, a wartime deposition that never made it into the official date, a protection decree that sat beside 300 kills, a forest floor with 200 buried industrial sites that untouched wilderness had no room to describe, and 2 founders, still present in nearly every living bison, whose overrepresentation nobody meant to create and nobody wrote down as significant until long after the fact. The wild population was not destroyed by that book, or by Notha's report, or by the 1888 decree. It was processed through a vocabulary that had a column for pedigree and no column for an April sighting, a category for protection and no category for the hunts happening under it, a word for wilderness and no word for a kiln buried beneath it. The founder signature remains, in every bison alive, unremarked on for 60 years because nothing in the record was built to remark on it. And if you sit with that long enough, it tells you exactly how a world stops being visible, not through fire, not through a decision anyone signed, through the completely ordinary act of a form having no place to put the thing that mattered. The next time you read that a species was saved by a decree, or that a forest was untouched, or that an extinction happened on a specific tidy date, you'll be looking at the kind of record this book is. It will look complete. It will use the vocabulary that replaced whatever came before it. You won't be able to tell, from the outside, what it left no room for. That's the one part this book can't show you. What it was like to be the bison still moving through that forest in April 1919, in the weeks after the record had already decided you were gone.